Look, I'm just gonna be real with you about this whole mess because, honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how everything went so wrong. I'm Cassidy, I'm 24, and 6 months ago, I thought I had my whole life figured out with this guy who I was sure was gonna be my husband someday. Now I'm sitting here alone, wondering how I managed to screw up the best thing that ever happened to me over some ink on my arm. But let me start from the beginning, because this story is wild, and I need someone to understand my side of things. We met at this little coffee place downtown through some mutual friends, and honestly, the connection was instant. Like scary instant. He had his life together, way more than most guys our age. Decent job, doing something with computers, his own place, actually knew how to have a real conversation. I was working retail at this boutique in the mall, nothing fancy, but it paid my bills and I got good discounts on clothes. The first few weeks were like a fairy tale. He'd bring me coffee at work, plan these sweet little dates, and we'd stay up all night just talking about everything. I felt like I'd finally found someone who actually got me. But then about 3 weeks in, I made what I thought was just casual conversation about tattoos. I'd been saving these gorgeous designs on Pinterest for years, and I was so excited to finally have someone to share them with. I showed him all these beautiful pieces I wanted to get, not trashy stuff, but real art. Flowers wrapping around my wrist, maybe a meaningful quote on my rib cage. Definitely a sleeve eventually, because I'd been dreaming about it since I was 16. The way his whole face changed when I said that should have been my first warning sign. He got this serious look and basically told me, straight up, that tattoos were a complete deal-breaker for him. Said he found them really unattractive on women, and if I got any, he'd probably have to end the relationship. I was honestly shocked, because who says that to someone they're supposed to be falling for? Like, excuse me. But it's my body, right? We had this huge fight about it, where I got all cold and gave him the silent treatment for 3 days, because I felt like he was trying to control me before we were even officially together. But then he started being extra sweet, bringing me my favorite coffee and planning these romantic dates. And eventually I caved and told him I understood. At the time, I guess I thought what we had was worth more than some tattoos. Plus, I was really falling hard for this guy, and didn't want to lose him over something that seemed kind of stupid when I really thought about it. My best friend Kira kept telling me I was crazy for giving up something I wanted for a man, but she didn't understand how perfect we were together. Everything felt like it was moving in the right direction. We started staying over at each other's places more, and I was already imagining us getting engaged, maybe moving in together. He made me feel so special, like I was the only girl in the world when we were together. But there was always this little voice in my head, wondering why he got to make rules about my body. I started noticing how he'd make comments about girls with tattoos when we'd see them out, calling them cheap or trashy. It bothered me, but I pushed those feelings down because I loved him and wanted our relationship to work. Looking back now, I can see that's probably when the resentment started building, even though I didn't want to admit it to myself. I kept telling myself I was being mature and compromising for love, but deep down, I was already starting to feel like he thought he owned me or something. Like his preferences automatically became more important than mine just because we were dating. But I buried all that because everything else felt so good, and I didn't want to rock the boat over something I convinced myself didn't really matter that much anyway. About 6 months into our relationship, I started testing boundaries in small ways just to see what would happen. I dyed my hair different colors, starting with just highlights, then going full blonde, then trying this deep burgundy shade that looked amazing on me. Each time I could tell he wasn't totally into it, but he never said anything directly, which felt like a win, like maybe he wasn't as controlling as I'd worried he might be. I also started putting on some weight because we were eating out constantly and I was comfortable, but he never made me feel bad about it. Actually seemed to like my curves more if anything. But the tattoo thing kept eating at me, like this constant itch I couldn't scratch. Kira was building this incredible sleeve, and every time I saw her, I felt so jealous. Here, I was holding back this huge part of who I wanted to be, for some guy who probably wouldn't even notice if I got something small and hidden. I started following more tattoo artists on Instagram, saving even more designs and fantasizing about finally getting my first piece done. The resentment was definitely building, because I felt like I was changing myself for him, while he got to stay exactly the same. Around month 8, I brought up tattoos again, but more casually this time. I showed him some really artistic, tasteful pieces, and tried to explain how it was about self-expression and personal growth, not just being rebellious. But he shut it down immediately, even more firmly than before. Said his opinion hadn't changed, and if anything, he was more sure than ever that tattoos weren't something he could accept in a partner. This time, I got really mad and we had an even bigger fight. I accused him of being closed-minded and controlling, and he accused me of not respecting his boundaries. We didn't talk for 2 whole days, which was the longest we'd ever gone without speaking. When we finally made up, the makeup was intense, like we were both trying to prove how much we loved each other. But something had definitely shifted for me after that fight. I started noticing how he'd make little comments about my choices, my clothes, my friends, even the shows I liked to watch. Nothing huge by itself, but it all felt connected to this bigger pattern of him thinking he knew what was best for me. The worst part was how reasonable he always sounded when he explained himself. He'd say things like, "I'm just being honest about what I find attractive," and "would you rather I lie to you," which made it hard to argue without sounding completely unreasonable. But inside, I was getting more and more frustrated with feeling like I had to shrink parts of myself to keep him happy. Every time Kira would show me her new tattoo work, I'd feel this deep pang of regret that I was holding myself back for someone else. I started wondering if this was how I wanted to spend the rest of my life, constantly checking with someone else before making decisions about my own body. The whole thing was making me question everything about our relationship. Even though I still loved him so much, it scared me sometimes. By month 10, I was at my absolute breaking point with the whole tattoo situation. Kira had just finished her sleeve and it looked absolutely incredible. This flowing design with flowers and geometric patterns that was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Every time I looked at it, I felt this mix of jealousy and regret that made my chest tight. That's when she suggested we take a girls' trip to this tattoo convention in the next city over, just to look around and get inspired. I figured there was no harm in just browsing, right? Well, that trip changed absolutely everything for me. We met this amazing artist named Rico, who specialized in exactly the style I'd been dreaming about for years. He had an opening the next day and offered to start a partial sleeve for me at a huge discount because it was convention pricing. Kira was so excited, saying this was fate, and I'd regret it forever if I didn't take this opportunity. I kept thinking about how my boyfriend was going out of town that week to visit his cousin and how this could be perfect timing. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the universe was giving me a sign. I was so tired of living my life according to someone else's arbitrary rules, especially when those rules felt controlling and unfair. So I did it. I spent the entire next day getting the outline and first part of my sleeve done. It hurt like crazy, but seeing it come to life on my skin felt like I was finally becoming who I was meant to be all along. The artist was incredible, and the design was even better than I'd imagined. Kira took a million pictures and kept telling me how badass I looked. For the first time in months, I felt completely like myself again. Like I'd been wearing this costume of who I thought he wanted me to be, and finally I could just be me. But as soon as I got home and saw my reflection, reality started hitting me hard. My entire arm was basically one giant scab wrapped in plastic and covered in healing ointment. There was absolutely no hiding this from him when he got back from his trip. Part of me was terrified, but another part was almost excited to see his reaction. Like maybe this would finally show him that I wasn't going to be controlled by his preferences anymore. Maybe it would be a wake-up call for him to examine his own biases about tattoos and realize how unfair he'd been. I spent the whole week while he was gone practicing what I'd say and how I'd explain that this was about my autonomy and self-expression. Kira helped me come up with all these arguments about bodily autonomy and artistic freedom. We decided that if he really loved me, he'd accept this part of who I was becoming. I convinced myself that he was being unreasonable, and maybe this shock would make him realize that. Looking back, I think I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew it would hurt him and probably cause a huge fight, but I was so resentful about feeling controlled that part of me almost wanted to punish him for making me choose in the first place. I told myself I was standing up for myself, but honestly, I think I just wanted to prove that he couldn't tell me what to do with my own body anymore. When he walked through the door after his week away, I was sitting on the couch trying to act casual, but my heart was absolutely pounding. He seemed really happy to see me, and started telling me all about his trip with his cousin. Then he noticed the bandaging on my arm, and asked what happened. The look on his face when I unwrapped it and showed him the tattoo, I'll honestly never forget it. It wasn't anger exactly, more like complete disappointment mixed with this sad resignation that made my stomach drop. He just stared at it for the longest time, without saying a single word. When he finally spoke, his voice was so calm, it was almost scary. He asked me to explain what had happened, and I launched into my whole prepared speech about how I'd thought about it and decided this was important to me. How I was tired of limiting myself for other people. And this was about my body and my choices. I told him about meeting Rico and how the opportunity just presented itself perfectly while he was out of town. I could see him getting more and more upset as I talked, but he wasn't yelling or freaking out like I'd expected him to. Instead, he just said that I'd made my choice. And now he was making his. Said the tattoo itself was bad enough, but the way I'd gone behind his back while he was away showed him exactly how much his feelings mattered to me. That stung because it wasn't entirely wrong, but I got defensive and told him he was being dramatic and controlling. Then he said something that really got under my skin. That I'd explicitly told him I understood his boundary and wouldn't get tattoos, and then deliberately waited until he was gone to break that promise. When he put it like that, it did sound pretty bad, but I was already in too deep to back down now. I told him that I'd changed my mind, and I had every right to do that. That people grow and evolve in relationships, and he should support my personal growth. But he just shook his head and said this wasn't about growth, it was about respect and trust. That really made me mad, because I felt like he was twisting everything to make me look like the bad guy, when all I'd done was make a decision about my own body. The fight escalated from there, with both of us saying things we probably shouldn't have. I ended up screaming at him to get out and locked myself in the bathroom while he gathered some of his stuff from my place. I could hear him on the phone with someone, probably his cousin, making plans to stay somewhere else for the night. When I finally came out, he was gone with most of his things, and honestly, I felt relieved. Like finally, I didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's arbitrary rules about my appearance. I called Kira immediately, and she came over with wine telling me I'd done the right thing. That any man who would leave over a tattoo wasn't worth keeping anyway. We spent the whole night talking about how controlling he'd been, and how much better off I was without someone trying to dictate my choices. But even as I was agreeing with everything she said, there was this nagging feeling in my chest that I'd messed up something really good over something that suddenly didn't feel as important as it had a week ago. I pushed that feeling down, though, because I didn't want to admit I might have made a huge mistake. 3 weeks went by without a single word from him, and honestly, I was starting to panic. I kept expecting him to call or text, but there was complete radio silence. My tattoo was healing beautifully, and I genuinely loved how it looked, but the satisfaction I'd felt was fading fast. I found myself checking his social media obsessively, but he'd barely posted anything except some work-related stuff. Meanwhile, I was posting pictures of my new ink, constantly hoping he'd see them and realize how amazing it looked. Kira kept telling me to move on, saying there were plenty of guys out there who'd appreciate my artistic expression. But I couldn't stop thinking about all the good times we'd had together. All the inside jokes and sweet moments and how safe I'd felt with him. Finally, I broke down and called him, and the conversation was so awkward and frustrating I wanted to scream. I started off trying to sound casual, like, "Hey, this whole drama has gone on long enough. When are you moving back in?" But he told me point blank that we were broken up and it was permanent. He didn't want to get back together at all. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I kept trying to explain that we just had a fight that got out of hand, and couples work through disagreements all the time. This was just a bump in the road, not the end of our relationship. But he kept saying it wasn't about the tattoo anymore. It was about trust and respect, and how I'd deliberately gone behind his back. I got so frustrated because he was making it sound like I'd cheated on him or committed some terrible crime. It was just a tattoo, for crying out loud. I tried a different approach, telling him I knew he was just too proud to admit he was wrong, and we could call it even and move past this whole thing. But he just kept repeating that it was over, and I needed to accept that and move on. After we hung up, I was so angry and hurt that I did something really stupid. I sent him some photos of myself, thinking maybe if he saw what he was giving up, he'd change his mind and realize he was making a huge mistake. But he just texted back telling me to delete his number and leave him alone. That's when I really started spiraling, because I could see on social media that he was already looking happier in his posts. He was hanging out with friends, going to events, seeming to do perfectly fine without me. It was like I'd never existed in his life at all. I tried reaching out through mutual friends, but they all said he'd asked them not to get involved in our drama. Even worse, I started hearing rumors that he was already talking to other girls. That drove me absolutely crazy, because here I was missing him and trying to fix things while he was just moving on, like our whole relationship meant nothing to him. I convinced myself that if I could just talk to him face to face, I could make him understand that we belonged together. So I started showing up places I knew he'd be. The gym we used to go to together, the coffee shop where we first met, even his work parking lot, a few times, just hoping to run into him. Each time he saw me, he looked more and more annoyed instead of happy like I'd hoped. Finally, he told me directly that if I kept following him around, he'd have to get a restraining order. That threat should have scared me into backing off, but instead it just made me more determined to prove that what we had was too special to throw away over one mistake. 6 months after he left, my whole world came crashing down in ways I never could have seen coming. It started when I went back to Rico to get the second part of my sleeve finished. He seemed totally different this time. Distant and professional instead of the friendly, flirty guy I remembered from before. When I asked him about the change in attitude, he casually mentioned that my ex had actually come by the shop a few weeks after our breakup. Apparently he'd wanted to understand what had happened, so he talked to Rico about the whole situation. That's when Rico told me something that made my stomach completely drop. He said my ex had been nothing but respectful and even thanked him for the good work, but mentioned how heartbroken he was that I'd lied to him and gone behind his back like that. Rico looked me dead in the eye and said he felt bad about being part of breaking up what sounded like a really good relationship. The worst part was that Rico had been telling this story to other clients, and word was getting around the local tattoo community about the girl who destroyed her relationship for some ink. But that was just the beginning of my nightmare. A few days later, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw something that made me physically sick to my stomach. My ex had gotten engaged. Not just dating someone new, but actually engaged to this girl named Sarah, who worked at some animal clinic. I spent hours looking through all her photos, and she was everything I wasn't. Natural beauty, no tattoos, seemed genuinely sweet and down to earth in every picture. The engagement photos were absolutely gorgeous, and you could see how genuinely happy they both looked together. What really destroyed me was reading all the comments from our mutual friends, congratulating them, and talking about how perfect they were together. Then I found out through Kira that Sarah had actually been in his life for a while. She was his cousin's veterinarian, and they'd met during that trip he took right before I got my tattoo. He'd never cheated or done anything wrong, but apparently they'd connected it immediately and started talking after our breakup. She was everything he'd been looking for in a partner. Someone who shared his values and actually respected his boundaries instead of testing them constantly. The final devastating blow came when I ran into his cousin at the grocery store a few weeks later. She used to really like me, and we'd always gotten along great, but now she could barely look at me. When I tried to make small talk, she just said she was glad her cousin had found someone who actually respected him for who he was. Then she said something that still haunts me to this day. She told me that Sarah had been hesitant to date him at first because she'd heard about his crazy ex-girlfriend who stalked him after their breakup. That's when I realized my reputation was completely destroyed in our social circle. People weren't seeing me as the independent woman who stood up for her bodily autonomy like I'd imagined. They saw me as the unstable girl who threw away a good relationship and then couldn't handle the consequences, like an adult. Even Kira started distancing herself from me after she heard all the gossip going around. My dating life became an absolute nightmare, because guys in our social circle had heard all the stories about what I'd done. The few dates I managed to get would always ask about my tattoo, and when I'd tell the story proudly expecting them to admire my independence, they'd get this look like they were wondering what other boundaries I might cross if we got serious. I'm sitting here now, almost a year later, with a beautiful sleeve that I still genuinely love, but that reminds me every single day of what I lost. He's married now, bought a house with Sarah, and from what I hear through mutual friends, they're already talking about starting a family together. Meanwhile, I'm completely alone with a reputation I can't repair, and the growing realization that I destroyed the best relationship I ever had because I couldn't handle being told no about something. But here's the thing, and I need someone to understand this. I still don't think I was completely wrong about the whole situation. It was my body and my choice to make. I just wish the consequences hadn't been so permanent and life-changing. Sometimes I wonder if there was a way I could have handled it differently. But then I remember how controlled I felt, and I know I had to stand up for myself somehow. I just never imagined it would cost me everything that actually mattered to me.